Okay. Hi, I'm Klos. I'm from Valencia College. This is my first time doing one of these things, so if I'm a little weird, I'm sorry. But I researched Tristan of Lyonesse. He's a character that's always been kind of elusive, but he's one of my favorites of the entire Arthurian cycle. So you can kind of understand a little bit how I've structured this. I want to be both a historian and an archaeologist, so we're going to be looking from two different perspectives the entire way through. So this is my journey of searching for the something new. So who was Tristan? He was the Prince of Lyonesse. Lyonesse is, or was, depending on who you're talking to at the current moment, was an island nation just off the coast of the Scilly Isles. There's currently a project right now going on where they're trying to uncover Lyonesse because it's manifested into such a huge entity within the population that it's not believed to just be a place of imagination anymore. We've got several ships that have actually gone down in the same area, and they believe that's coming from the spires of the buildings of this lost island. So that's a little bit about Lyonesse. He was also the lover of Isolde of Ireland. Anybody familiar with Isolde? Mm-hmm. Yeah? A little, maybe? Okay. There are three of them, so if you're not, it's okay. There was Isolde of Ireland, which is the one that was with Tristan. There was Isolde the Queen, her mother, and then Isolde of the White Hand, Isolde of Brittany. So it gets a little bit hairy. If you ever do your own readings, just remember there are three, and try to always keep those straight. According to Merlin, he was considered the most excellent knight. Upon his birth, he was told that he would be the most courteous and the bravest of all knights to ever walk the planet. So that ruffled a few feathers from day number one for him. He also refused openly to convert to Christianity, and this is something really, really huge when you start talking about the Arthurian cycle, because according to most historians, Arthur is considered to be the first benevolent or Christian king. So that's not going to really work out well for him, depending on who you talk to. His father is Ravalin. He was considered to be the richest king ever to grace Britain, so he would have been the king of Lyonesse. Lyonesse in itself was kind of like one of those really terrible flood stories, kind of like almost a Sodom and Gomorrah. It was a terribly rich place with all of this stuff going on, and everybody wanted to be there, and then it just vanished off the map from a huge, huge flood. And his name quite literally means sorrow, which is rather unfortunate. So if you want to know where the proposal of Lyonesse is, I've got this little map up here for you. Those are the Scilly Isles, and then Lyonesse is supposed to be about right there. So we're not too far off, but it's strange to me that it's taken us this long to really get this started. But as I mentioned earlier, the Cornish government is currently working on the Lioness Project. This started in 2011. All of the details on that are still on hard lockdown, but it is something that you can actively look up and they'll say, yes, we are investigating this. This is the technology being used. Other than that, no details have been released just yet. So whenever you start looking for anything dealing with Tristan specifically, you're going to have to go through a plethora of sources because he's been written out of most things. The most complete that we have is going to be Gottfried von Strasbourg. Most people just refer to it as Gottfried. That's going to be the High Middle German text. You can get most of that in its entirety now, and it's been translated, which is rather nice. But the earlier versions are going to be Eilhard and Beirol. But Mallory, more often than not, is the one that people refer to most because it's the easiest to read. I note that kind of with a hesitation. It's the easiest to read. It's not necessarily the most accurate or the one that I would say you need to go to first. But a fun fact about Mallory and his translation is he chose to always put the Tristan story directly in the center because he felt that the entire cycle revolved around this one night. So it's always been in the backs of all of these writers' minds that they needed to keep this story in the front run. Tristan before Isolde, his mother died giving birth to him. This is really one of those tragic stories, and it almost goes back to the Arthur story itself in many aspects. They have a terrible amount in common. His father is killed in battle, so the king dies. He then is supposed to assume to the throne, but obviously this happens when he's incredibly young, so he can't assume to the throne yet. He goes through most of his life not realizing who he is. So his entire life is this terrible identity crisis. He does achieve perfection by age 15, which is he's a great lover, he's a great knight, he plays music, and he's well-traveled. So this tends to really not do well for him in other courts because no one wants to be shown up by a 15-year-old. Merlin does place him in several homes, but he will ultimately end up staying with his uncle, King Mark of Cornwall. So that's going to be where all of his troubles really begin. And as I mentioned earlier, he does not know who he is most of his life. He'll always introduce himself as Tristan, but he won't say, oh, I'm a prince, or I have these abilities. And he does carry on the traditions of the old religion. So every time you read something about Tristan specifically, it will never have any of the new ideas attached to it. Other characters will bring in these new ideas, such as Lancelot. The Celtic tradition surrounding Tristan is extremely rich. This illustration is, you'll find it captioned two ways. One way as the boy king Cuchulainn, and another is Tristan. So if we still have no idea who it actually picks, which I thought was really interesting. But Cuchulainn and Deirdre is supposedly the origin story of Tristan and Isolde. So if you ever want to dig back into the Welsh Triads, the Black Book of Carmarthen, or any of these other ancient books, you can find some other stories that are very, very uncanny to this story. All of his events do kind of correlate to major Celtic festivals if you go back into old paganism. So that in itself is pretty cool. He does always leave behind ivy for her. Ivy is something that is extremely sacred to the pagan Celts. So that would have been another big clue if you're reading between the lines, so to speak, when you start going through these translations, realizing that maybe these people aren't following the change in the society that they're living in. We mentioned a little bit earlier Merlin having a prophecy about him whenever he was born. So we always knew that his parents were going to die very young. That was always said. Whenever it actually came to pass, the child was taken into custody and then told that he would be this big, courageous, excellent person, and he really was never able to escape from that identity. He did eventually do all of these things, but they would lead to his death. The thing that really thrust him into kind of a world stage, especially into the Round Table where we know him from today, was this event. Tristan kills Morholt. Morholt was the cousin / uncle, depending on which one you read, of the Queen Isolde of Ireland. Some say she was also the lover, so I don't really want to get into that part, but yeah, that's all kinds of messed up. But anyways, the way this went down was Tristan really, really, really wanted to break into the Round Table, but he didn't have a way in. He was no one. He had no claim. And the way that you could get into the Round Table is if you killed another one and took his seat. It's not really the best way, but it's a way in. This did happen. It initially started over something quite honorable. It was a slave trade argument. Tristan said that there should not be slaves going to Ireland. Morholt said there should be slaves going to Ireland, as he was an Irish knight. So that ended up really, really messing him up. So they travel to an island, and Tristan is able to kill Morholt, but Morholt does stab him with a poisoned dagger. This is how we get the story of Tristan and Isolde, with her nursing him back to health, so on and so forth. It does come from this poisoned dagger. So that didn't work out at all. A couple of things you need to know if you're going through some of these translations, because I'm here to tell you firsthand experience, this was absolutely nuts. Going through as many of the primary resources as I could get my hands on. Some of them are translated, some of them are only half translated. You don't always know what you're walking into, and you don't realize how many words are exactly the same. For instance, poison, potion, same word in the Latin that these were written in. So one of the big debates that's always brought up whenever you study this particular story is the love potion. We don't know that it was a love potion so much as it could have been a poison. So that's another interesting thing to think about. If he was killing someone in their family, why wouldn't they want to poison him? Wouldn't you want to poison somebody? They just killed your uncle, right? So I think it's a perfectly good question to ask of what really was going on there. But the High Middle German of the original Gottfried has never been specifically translated. You can buy a translated copy, but there'll always be a disclaimer in the beginning saying this is the closest we can get. There are no more specific High Middle German speakers anymore for us to get as close as possible to what that original text may have been. But that is the most complete one that we have. And specifically when you're going through Gottfried and the Tavola Rotunda, Christianity is only mentioned in the first stanza of these stories, yet we attach it to the whole story. So I think that perhaps this could have just been a statement of the times that they were living in, not specifically the ideals of these characters. So a little bit of the religious climate that was going on at the time. The only that the Irish people would have known about would have been the story of Cullen. They wouldn't have been running around talking about Tristan and Isolde. This was a much later invention. But the story of Tristan did become extremely popular around 1000. That's when we start to see a huge influx of interest, and a lot of the writings come out. Most of the writings that we have today didn't actually start until around 1160. So we're still extremely far removed whenever you look at the majority of the time datings that we have from the Arthurian cycle. Most historians tend to agree that this happened somewhere between 420 and about 520. So we're still about 500 years removed from when we have writings. The Catholic Church was very much in control of literature. We're all familiar with this section of history. We know who held the big stick here. Characters such as Merlin did begin to be painted in a very, very negative light. It was no longer okay to be a prophet or okay to be a magician. You were now an instrument of the devil. So we really have to back up sometimes and realize what was being twisted whenever we read it, and kind of take that into respect. Tristan was reduced to an adulterer, Lancelot becomes the hero, and other works are then slowly suppressed. Whenever you start to read the Gottfried version, he very much paints Tristan in a very positive light. When you read the Tavola Rotunda, the Italian version, Tristan becomes a terrible human being. So you can see where the seeds were being planted and what parts of the world were jumping on that bandwagon and when they got there. So I find that to be one of the more interesting aspects of this research, was who started this huge debate on morals, specifically. So we mentioned a little bit about Lancelot. Now Lancelot creates a ton of problems for Tristan and his father before him. Lancelot was extremely Christian, and it was his dream to kind of bring that to the rest of the world. He thought he was doing a wonderful thing. So he would go to Lyonesse and build all of these big, beautiful churches and kind of leave them there. And there is a knight, I don't believe so, yes, right here towards the bottom, you can read it. But he says that he would rather die as a knight than rot in a Christian prison. So I mean, they're not on board with this at all. They like the way that things are going. The Fontana del Lion, this was another one of Merlin's prophecies. He said that there would be 3 great knights, and they would be in specific order. Tristan is always listed as the first. Lancelot is always listed as the second. Not a good nail in the coffin for poor Tristan there. Galahad is always number 3. I always felt kind of bad for him. I mean, come on, he was trying. But as I mentioned earlier, really into archaeology, so I had to show you this. This is the Tristan Stone, and this is going to be in Cornwall, not too far from Castle Dore. Some people say that this could be a gravesite of Tristan himself. I don't specifically buy that, but it is something that they're looking into. It does read, here lies Tristan, son of Tristan. Tristan is a Welsh form of the exact same name. So if you want to get super technical, this could be a descendant, it could be a son, but I don't specifically, there's no evidence to point to that is our Tristan. There have been no excavations on this area to show that it even is a grave. They will not allow that at this time. Maybe with the Lioness Project, things will change. But specifically, most pagans, and only the sect that I'm from do I know about, we don't get buried. It's traditional to either be burned or be put back to sea. And then we talked a little bit about the Lioness Project earlier, but it is a full underwater excavation around Land's End for the entire city. And this is something that the folklore of that area has been so strong that they called for this to happen, this huge, huge project. It's seven stones of the lions is what they call the area of the sea where the ships keep going down. So whenever we finally get to the bottom of whatever this pit is, who knows how many hundreds of years we're going to find of things that we just have been missing forever. So I think it's really cool that they finally wised up to that. So that's what I have. I hope you guys...
Thank you very much for such beautiful presentations. Now we're taking questions for both.